I am reading The Laird and the Lady, and I finished yesterday the second part, and this is part 3, Invitation to a Ball. This is the story of Marylda and Rowan. It is a novel by Joan Marshall Grant. She wrote books about her previous lives, Winged Pharaoh and Life of Carola, amazing, interesting books from times long, long ago. This one was published in 1949 and plays in that era. Invitation to a Ball. Marylda and Rowan are married. He lives in a castle in the Highland of Scotland called Cloud, and he has a grandmother called Georgina. The late October gale would have driven most people to shelter, but Rowan and Georgina lingered in the chill dusk to watch the last of the trees which had been planted to conceal the influence of the first Miss Blenkinsop being hauled to the great barn. Georgina, had your command of strategy been recognized earlier, Eisenhower would have made you a general. It would have been a gross neglect of talent to do less. Meaning that you're not displeased at the faculty with which I have caused certain people to fall in with our plans. It is salutary to discover how antiseptic honesty can be when properly applied. However, one dare not partake of what is labeled for external use only. We bluff the others, but we do not allow ourselves to be lulled into a false security. Exactly. But that doesn't mean that we may not permit ourselves a pat on the back for what is already achieved. We have removed the taboo of Emilie's memory, and Marylda is no longer embarrassed at being her niece. And what is so encouraging is that the dear child is cooperating, if quite unconsciously. You have more guile than I ever gave you credit for, to have made her suggest most of the moves we planned. You put the ideas into her head by being so clever about breaking the news of the second Miss B. Georgina took a packet of cigarettes from the pocket of her jacket and lit one with a gold lighter, which Marylda had given her. You must not give me undue credit for the things I enjoy. It was most stimulating to find myself sufficiently intelligent to make even Alistair think I had deliberately deceived him instead of allowing the stuffies to laugh at us. Without undue conceit, I think the touch about Malcolm telling me, in strict confidence, that he had discovered Marylda's real identity from the American embassy while arranging the formalities of your marriage, and asking whether he should have leave you in ignorance until after the ceremony, was quite masterly. That you decided to let her be patronized as a little nobody until we thought the joke had gone far enough was an example of porky humor that even the least of our neighbors can appreciate. No one except you could have carried it off, and, God forgive me, I used to think you the last bulwark of Edwardian smugness. The Edwardians were not in the least smug. Their morals, within their own stamping grounds, would shock you young moderns, if only you knew what really went on. But we had a certain code of actual freedom and outward formality which unfortunately I never had the opportunity to share. She laughed. What does one do for one's children? What one does for one's children. I have learned to use the telephone for purposes of gossip, an instrument I consider unworthy of more than instructions to the straight tradesman. That Jean was undoubtedly listening in to every word became an added incentive to histrionic powers I belatedly discovered. At least I was assured of an enthralled audience of one, instead of being indignant that so avid an ear listened at the mechanical keyhole. Sometimes I could hardly resist congratulating her on the discovery that there are compensations in being a telephone operator in a village where the usual grist to the mill of conversation is no more than an argument about a discrepancy of a penny in the grocer's book. That Jean was undoubtedly listening in to every word became an added incentive to histrionic powers I belatedly discovered. At least I was assured of an enthralled audience of one, instead of being indignant that so avid an ear listened at the mechanical keyhole. Sometimes I could hardly resist congratulating her on the discovery that there are compensations in being a telephone operator in a village where the usual grist to the mill of conversation is no more than an argument about a discrepancy of a penny in the grocer's book. I hear that Jean has had 3 proposals of marriage, having hinted at the missionary dance that her intended might discover that was going on at the castle. We've gone too far to draw back, but are we sure that leading Marylda to think kindly of Emilie is quite safe? I think so, he said slowly. I've had moments of funk, but she seemed much less nervy. When I suggested treating the new ring as an amusing example of Edwardian taste instead of a skeleton in a cupboard. Not, if I may say so, a tactful metaphor, interrupted Georgina. I know, but the point is that it didn't upset her. She laughed and said, "Poor skeleton, let's teach her to dance again." And she couldn't have said that if she knew Emilie was horribly alive. So, you're not worried at the prospect of a tenant's ball in Emilie's banqueting hall on New Year's Eve? No, not really. I think it's the most antiseptic thing we could have possibly planned, and somehow we made Marylda suggest it. There won't even be the echo of other gatherings, for she is having ridiculously expensive food sent from London, and quantities of hired waiters, and champagne and ice buckets, and surely the most tangible ghost would withdraw in the face of a pimply waiter from Soho carrying an out-of-season pineapple. Alice would ignore them, but Emilie might feel entirely at home, said Georgina, with a severity not unmixed with trepidation. Emilie would probably give every female guest a corsage of orchids, but the orchids available in midwinter in the more remote Highlands are minimal. I shall tell Grummy to have orchids flown over. We must be sure even the little details will make Emilie feel it's her party. Excellent, said Duncan, who was sitting with Marylda in his car, which, as the weather grew colder, they found a more convenient headquarters than their usual rendezvous in the abundant croft. You've done a magnificent job with Rowan and the old lady. I believe they think the ball was their idea. He relit his pipe with care. Protect me from the subtlety of women. What you mean is, protect me with the subtlety of women, for until we've got Hector and Emilie settled, neither of us can afford the comfortable ignorance, which is one of the masculine luxuries. Shake, partner, he took her hand and then bent to kiss it. My dear, if I have ever been stupid enough to belittle female courage, forgive me. For a moment he stared through the window, which made an ephemeral division between the illusion of security and the wind driving down from the hills. The Scot conquers in the recognition of his femininity. It was not for nothing that the kilted regiments of my father's war were called the ladies from hell, but we are afraid of that side of our nature, and so maintain prodigies of endurance, which make us honoured in the engine rooms of ships and feared in the marketplaces. Rowan and I, bloody proud of being brave, and we had to land the real danger on you, because we couldn't face up to it. She laughed to hide the tremor in her voice. You can watch a gralloch that turns me up and take the easier way of looking at a spook. But it isn't easier, he said vehemently. My God, how I hate letting you go on with this thing. If only Cloud wasn't Cloud, I'd tell Rowan to sell the damn place and take you away. I doubt if Emilie would find the new owners more congenial. Sorry, I know you're right, that we've got to think of her and Hector, but unless you're with me, I'm too selfish to worry about anyone except you. Are you sure it's not getting too tricky? She deliberately pretended to misunderstand. It's getting easier now that I'm deliberately trying to get close to her instead of pretending she isn't there. There are times when it's not entirely cozy. The day I went into the closed ring for the first time. But there's no point in dwelling on horrors. Tell me, you must tell me, he said urgently. Darling, don't get fussed. Honestly, it was nothing really bad. When I first went into the rooms that were never finished, it was only like going into one of the period homes that are so carefully preserved in America, which had been abandoned before it was ready for the public. The passages were cluttered with rusty radiators and lengths of pipe that had never been connected. Baths were lying on their sides like dead hippos. Rolls of carpet hangings, wallpaper, and everywhere was quiet with dust. There was even a bag of tools and the remains of a red cotton handkerchief that had held one of the workmen's lunch. Luckily, I don't mind rats much. I didn't feel anything really odd until I began to wonder what color the curtains would have been in one of the new bedrooms. Suddenly, I knew that the suites were to be called after flowers, and that the curtain fabrics, glazed chintz, had been specifically printed to match the wallpapers. The flowers were daffodil, rose. That one had a trellis with very thorny roses of a particular hideous pink. Wisteria, fat bunches of it, each flower more solid than a hothouse grape, and lily, Madonna lilies with acid green leaves and water lilies in a frieze. I went to the room where I had seen the rolls still in their original sacking covers. I had a knife with me, and as I ripped them open I knew what I was going to see, and I did. But the gates should have warned you not to be surprised. The gates were different. I saw gates that had been there, but it was quite impersonal. The time element was the only odd factor. But then when I was looking at the wallpapers, I felt two quite distinct reactions to them. I, Marylda, thought they were rather pathetic examples of outmoded and unjustified taste. But she thought they were beautiful and enormously chic. She laughed shakily. You see, Duncan, I was thinking as me and as Emilie at the same time, and both of us were sure we were right. Then I went downstairs again and into the banqueting hall, and somehow I got more Emilie-ish, for I thought the stained glass windows and the ghastly yellow oak minstrel gallery and the panelling that looks as though it is embellished with gigantic petrified parsley were magnificent. I felt enormously self-satisfied at having designed it all. Another thing I didn't like, when I became Marylda again, I remembered that while I was admiring the room there wasn't any dust, and the sun was shining through the east windows and making coloured patterns on the floor, which of course was impossible because of the trees. But I didn't notice anything odd about that until nearly an hour later, when I found myself sitting in the Italian garden making plans for a New Year's Eve ball. I knew the rooms that joined the banqueting hall to the castle couldn't be finished in time, so there was to be a covered way leading from the drawing room. The house party would dine on the dais under the south window, which would later be used for the orchestra. That's why we are having Emilie's dance all over again, because I know that the thing she's too afraid to remember happened just afterwards. She doesn't know why she came back here. That's why I have to go. I've got to live through it with her. He looked at her without speaking. What could he say when he longed to tell her he would never let her go back to Cloud, that he wanted to take her away now to Daloch, to the ends of the earth? But if he let her know he was in love with her, she mightn't trust him. She'd have to fight this thing alone, for it was Rowan she loved. He was only dear old Duncan, the faithful confidant. You agree that's the only sensible thing to do? She said. Sensible? Oh my God, sensible. I think it's so incredibly brave that I'm speechless. But you can't do it, my darling. Don't you realize that you are deliberately risking a split personality? It's still under your control. You can stop being Emilie. But say she won't. You might live as Emilie, think as Emilie, be lost in a pattern that has been passed by half a century of clock time, but is still valid in its own dimension. Emilie doesn't want to stay in her hell. She's trying to pretend it's a heaven. That's why she won't make an effort to face whatever has made her so afraid that she prefers to go on being a ghost. Oh, damn, Emilie. Think of yourself and Rowan. I am thinking of myself. In a funny kind of way, I feel more than just her niece. If it's only hereditary, which quite candidly I don't believe, I'm not going to risk my children inheriting it. So you see, I'm being quite selfish. I think you're being... No, skip it. Silly? No, not silly. With an effort he patted her hand and said briskly, when I told you, months ago, that Rowan was damned lucky, well, I meant it. He glanced at the dashboard clock. We'll have to hurry or you'll be late. The lights of the car shone ahead of them against the mist. This is the ending of the first chapter of part 3, and the second chapter is entitled Second Shot. Have a lovely Wednesday. Thursday.